Hello, I'm Matthew Stepanek,
And I'm Rayanne Haynes.
and this is Let's Get Lit, the Drunk Poetry Podcast. In every episode of Let's Get Lit, we interview poets of stature about their work and about the power and relevancy of poetry in order to support and promote it, and along with the arts and literacy. In a conversational style, we're going to enjoy a glass of wine, chosen to match the poet's personality and style, while also learning more about each poet and asking why poetry matters to them. Hopefully, we'll be able to maintain our composure as we move closer to some form of bacchanal truth. So, my name is Matthew Stepanek, as I said earlier, and I'm a freelance writer, editor, and poet based in Edmonton, Alberta. And I'm the editor of Glass Buffalo Literary Magazine and also the poetry editor for 18 Bridges. I am the author of a collaborative novel called Project Compass, written with 3 other writers. And I also have a poetry chapbook called Relying on That Body, which is all about season 10 of RuPaul's Drag Race.
Very cool.
Yeah, and another newer piece of news for me is that alongside Jason Purcell, I'm managing Glass Bookshop, which is Edmonton's newest bookshop that promises a curated reading life, and we've started selling books at literary events in the city.
Yeah, I'm very excited for you and Jason and what's coming your way, and really excited for Edmonton and the new bookshop that we're going to have.
Thanks.
Yeah. And I'm Rayanne Haynes. I'm an award-winning fiction author, poet, and the executive director of Edmonton Poetry Festival. I do have a fictional novel in verse that came out last year titled Stain with the Colors of Sunday Morning. But this isn't about us. So we would like to thank our sponsors and our presenters before we begin. And we would like to specifically thank wine expert Gurvinder Bhatia for his generosity, because he sponsored the wine for all of our episodes out of his own private cellar, which is really cool.
Let's Get Lit is presented with the Writers Guild of Alberta, and we're grateful for their support in promoting and sharing this podcast with their members, because they do a lot of wonderful things for promoting and working with writers in Alberta. So
they do.
It's great to align with them on this. And as you're listening to us ramble and drink, and our wonderful guest, feel free to share your thoughts on our conversation with us on Twitter at @lets_lit. And so, as Rayanne and I are actually not alone right now,
No.
I feel like I need to introduce the other poet in the room. Jenna Butler is our special guest today, and she is the author of 3 critically acclaimed books of poetry: Seldom Seen Road, Wells, and Aphelion, an award-winning collection of ecological essays, A Profession of Hope, Farming on the Edge of the Grizzly Trail. And Butler's current work is the travelogue Magnetic North, Sea Voyage to Svalbard, which launched in 2018 with the University of Alberta Press, and that's mostly what we'll be discussing today. So I guess thank you, Jenna, for joining us today, and welcome.
Oh, thank you so much. It's a real pleasure to be here.
Excellent. So our wine for today's podcast reflect not only the wine that we're going to be drinking, but also the winery. When I researched wines, I kept coming back to Jenna as a person and her commitment to building things and to learning. We know, and we will talk more later, about the fact that Jenna and her husband have built from scratch a fully off-grid, sustainable, and organic farm, which they also hope to turn into a writer's retreat one day, which is very cool. And so I had a lot of trouble picking just one wine with Jenna because of her different styles of writing, and she's such a vibrant person that we chose both a Pinot Noir and a Pinot Noir Rosé for our chat with Jenna today. So we're going to have a lot of wine to drink.
We've already had a lot of drink.
Both of the wines come from the 50th Parallel Estate Winery in Okanagan, in the Okanagan Valley in BC. And what I thought was really neat was that, like Jenna's farm, the 50th Parallel Estate was built from scratch. So in 2009, the couple that owned the winery hand-planted their first 10 acres of vines. And I know from reading Jenna's blog and talking to her that her and her husband did the same thing with their place, hand planting everything out there every day. The owners had to engineer a planting machine to turn the needs of their rocky, steep property, and are now planting an impressive 50 acres under vine. So I think that, later Jenna can talk more about the needs of adapting to the needs of the land. But the two wines, so we have the Pinot Noir Rosé, and that's a mix of fresh young garden strawberries, guava, and yellow bell pepper combined. And it has a long, refreshing finish. It comes from the touch of a silky Pinot skin tannin extracted from a long and slow ferment. But Jenna's lighthearted soul and kind yet carefully thoughtful manner made it an excellent wine to sample with her. And I think that her natural inclination to take on new challenges with fervor and gusto fit perfectly with this blend. And then the second wine that we chose is the Pinot Noir from the winery. And that's a more full-bodied wine from a dry vintage that shows off developed flavors of dark red fruits and ripe staccato cherries, black raspberries, blackberries, dried rosemary and sage. I mean, there's so many earthy mineralities in this wine. It's quite lovely. And I think that Jenna's love for the land and her sublime use of language and contemplative nature made this a natural fit. So I can really clearly envision her sitting next to a wood-burning stove in her off-grid farmhouse this fall sipping this wine. But I think that, Matthew and I wanted to really make clear that the wines that we chose were really specifically related to the fact that this winery was also an off-grid winery, and so all of those aspects fit with why we would choose these wines for Jenna. Mm-hmm. Okay, so Jenna, full disclosure, we've had a relationship and a friendship over a number of years, and you and I had a conversation at LitFest. But during LitFest, we were talking about the fact that you and your husband travel on average the distance of Edmonton to Vancouver every week, because you're traveling from Red Deer to, you're a huge part of the Edmonton literary community to Edmonton. You're traveling to up north for your farm. So what do you think about when you're alone in your car, or what do you do when you're alone in your car?
Right. So full disclosure, when I don't always do the driving on my own, which is really lovely. My husband still substitute teaches in Edmonton, so he's up and down a lot. So when we travel together, we actually read to each other, which I really love. We take turns kind of reading whatever book is on the go, our car book. If we're going between the farm and Red Deer, so it'll be once a week. So we were reading just recently Peter Wohleben's The Hidden Lives of Trees, which was a fantastic book. He's a forester in the Black Forest of Germany, talking about the insider info he has on trees and stuff. So it's really neat to talk to kind of talk about his work and just read it with someone else and have these amazing discussions. Yeah. He knows that ecosystem so well. It's pretty fantastic. Yeah. And when I'm on my own, which I am a fair amount, running up and down, I compose poetry in my head, not on my voice memo, on the phone. Try not to be texting while driving. Jenna gets arrested for a podcast. No.
Let's give them your license plate number, and so they can watch for you and doing things.
Yeah, that rogue poet. Right.
No. That I love the idea of a road poet, though.
I was going to say rogue poet, but rogue poet also.
The road poet.
Either one works.
Yeah.
Yeah, but I'm that person who's talking to myself in the car on my own, going up and down the highway. So I compose stuff. I hash over ideas for essays, or I teach as well. So I run over my students now. I run through ideas for my classes.
Okay.
My students are going to listen to this podcast and think, oh boy, yeah.
They're gonna. I mean, I'm sure that your students love you. I'm quite
You're
sure.
gonna be like, that's par for the course, Jen.
It's just interesting, like all the almost illegal things that we've caught you in a couple of minutes. Yeah, so I appreciate that. Let's Get Lit does not condone drinking and driving.
No, we do
Or
not.
writing poems and driving. So thank you, Jenna,
There we
for
go.
scaring everybody straight. We'll find you. Someone will find you. How it always goes.
Yes.
Now I'm scared
Criminals
to get
get
back
caught.
on the highway.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Someone else was driving tonight.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yay.
Well, maybe we should talk a little bit, since we are going to be talking about magnetic north. Can you, before we jump into our big, huge discussion, can you tell us a little bit about how the book came about?
Yeah, absolutely. So the book came out of a writer-in-residence position I held on a barkentine sailing ship back in 2014 at the Norwegian Arctic Circle. So I was up there for 2 weeks over the summer solstice. So 24-hour daylight in the Arctic Ocean with 30 other writers and musicians and artists and scientists and polar bear guards and the ship's crew, but people from all over the world. And we were kind of sardined into like 600 square feet of cabin space for 2 weeks.
Wow.
And it was phenomenal. It was an incredible residency, and also it was incredible to get the chance to see the landscape, but it was also sort of in terms of interpersonal relationships. For someone who's fairly introverted, it was at times pretty trying being in a very, very small space.
Yeah.
So you get to learn
Yes.
a lot about your colleagues, and some of them are still really good friends. And so the book came out of that trip. So looking at the Arctic landscape and contemplating kind of the interpersonal relationships and dynamics on a very small vessel, and thinking about the explorer narratives that are out there that are predominantly male. And so thinking in terms of just people in general crammed into this small space in a very, at times, very hostile environment. I can't imagine being up there over the winter. It was, the 24-hour daylight was pretty intense. And also connecting that endangered landscape back to the boreal forest of northern Alberta, which is what I call home, and which is threatened in a different kind of way. So up on the ship in Svalbard, every time we made landfall, we would pick garbage because the ocean currents from around the world just drop garbage on Spitsbergen. And so we were really aware of the human impact, even though there weren't that many people there.
So this kind of barren
Very much so.
landscape was covered in garbage.
There was, well, not covered in garbage, but there was a lot on the beaches. Like you'd make landfall for an afternoon, you'd probably bring 2 garbage bags back.
Wow.
Oh, wow.
And so we were constantly loading up the ship, just bags of garbage. And, in some ways it felt good that we were keeping that place tidied up. In other ways it was shocking how much human trash makes its way halfway across the world and ends up there. But it's a peculiar landscape because it is, at the same time, it is barren and vast. It's also peopled. And it's got these really visible layers of history because it's the Arctic landscape and it's desiccating and dry. And so any remains that are left there are still there. So you have the whaling outposts from the 1800s where the wood was brought over from places like Russia because there's no wood on Svalbard. So the wood was all brought over to build the whaling stations or cannibalized from other buildings or boats. And then you have the Russian mining colonies of the 20s to some of them the present day. They've been abandoned and recolonized. And then you have the tourist towns and the tourist settlements. And so like layer and layer and layer and layer of history. Just, everything is still there.
Yeah.
Yeah, and so many countries have had their finger in the pie, as it were, on Svalbard.
Wow. Wow.
So that's where the book came out of. It was like trying to cram so much of that experience, that really intense sort of 24-hour day, like 2 weeks, into this little tiny book.
Wow. Well, it's a beautiful book.
Thank you.
Well, yeah, I mean, we're going to talk a lot about it in the podcast, but do you want to start us off with a reading? And Matthew and I were thinking night.
Yes.
Yes.
I'd love to.
Okay.
Yeah, I'd be happy to do that. So night, one of the things, I should just preface, one of the things I mentioned was 24-hour daylight. So darkness became, and I mentioned this when we were talking earlier for the podcast, that darkness kind of became its own character over the course of the book, and I didn't start out to write that. It just 24-hour daylight does something to your body, and your circadian rhythm gets kind of destroyed. So night and the privacy of darkness and what it does to you kind of psychologically, not having that space to retreat to. Again, especially in 600 square feet where you are around other people at all times. You share a cabin, you share a common space. You're never apart from anyone else because there are polar bears around. You cannot be alone.
Oh my gosh, polar
Right?
bears.
When you're on land, you are guarded with guards with rifles.
And we're going to talk about that after too. We are going to talk about that.
So yeah, it's like it's literally like a YouTube channel sort of live streaming from your living room 24 hours a day. It's intense being on public display all the time.
Yeah.
Just reminds me of Lost a little bit. We need polar bear guard. There's only ever one polar bear.
I thought you were going to say Walking Dead.
Oh, great!
Oh my god, like, I do not watch Walking Dead. I prefer shows that were, like, over 10 years old.
Okay, maybe the boat wasn't that bad. Man, my friends are going to be listening from the boat going, she's calling us The Walking Dead.
No.
Yeah.
Okay, so I'll read Night, and it starts off with this epigraph from Monty Reed. Declension stalks the snow cover. It wonders how many people it is, how many mouths. There's no place to hide. Night is non-existent, circadian cranked to overtime. No twilight, no dusk, no dawn. Same abbreviated shadows on the road. We jitter, grateful for anything that dims the light. Snow squalls, cloud banks, duty-free Svalbard whiskey. Something in us paces, sleepless, sits on its haunches and observes morning rituals of black coffee and yay toast, uneasy company. Svalbard bleaches its bones 4 months of the year, stretched thin by sun like a drum on a frame. Its wild places crack in the heat, tundra canvassed out, pinned, strained. 24 hours a day, the hunt. Reindeer on the Campion Flats, polar bears along the beaches. Fox dens green to uncanny mounds, small death forests visible from the air. So much sun that entrails clapped blue against the rock morph in an instant to chickweed, pygmy buttercup, Svalbard poppy. Blood runs amok, sun-spurred, no easy resting place. Birds at all hours, a ferment of terns over stone couch nests, fulmars ricocheting from the cliffs. Inner harbor, mid-evening, 14 belugas breaching, heat calling them to the surface like bergs on a slow turn. The darkness becomes mythic, vein shot, red light through pinched eyelids. We are bitter, amped. Our bodies want to move, to work, to love. We burn out in 3-day stints, sleep through afternoons, emerge into perpetual midday. Tremors in our hands, daylight bubbling in bloodstreams. What we took for granted, the relief of the dark. How concealment, too, is a sort of blessing. Aboard ship, dark becomes an interior country. 30 people in 600 square feet, the middle of the Greenland Sea, the top of the world. We learn what the explorers knew, that darkness is not a right but an indulgence. You do what you need to find it. The bar is open as long as the sun is up. Love, too, is a kind of darkness, a momentary way of abandoning the body. Forget where you left yourself. Don't look for tracks. The wilderness is in the darkness, and the darkness is internal, layered over, contents under pressure, coalescing into something much less human, more keen. If darkness is the fringe land, sidestep the mirror, all the world in your eyes, staring back.
Wow.
Thank you. Well, I mean, we started with night, so I want to talk about darkness and light in the poem and in the collection itself, because I'm interested in the idea that you said that darkness became its own character. And normally, like in poetics, there's this positivity around light, and like, the negativity is darkness, and even in sadness, and how often we associate those two things together. But in this, you're talking about darkness as desire and love and indulgence, and I'm wondering if you can maybe talk a little bit more about your experience in existing in this permanent light space and what you did to escape it,
Sure.
or how this came.
I cannot imagine living up there all through the summers. I think I would probably lose what was left of my mind at the time. But
Yeah.
or over the winters when you got 6 months of darkness, that too I think would be pretty fraught. But I mean, I was thinking about that very idea when I was driving up here, knowing that we're heading into the dark time of the year, right? When for us, 5 or 6 hours of daylight, oh no. And at the same time, it's just like, it kind of crushes your soul a little bit. But that whole idea that I didn't start out to write dark as a character is just something that I while I was thinking about the trip after the fact, I realized that the entire time I had literally been vibrating, and it got worse as I went through the days. And it's because your circadian rhythm is getting disrupted. Your sleep, even when you sleep like 6 or 7 hours, you don't feel like you've slept, and your body is just on all the time. And it didn't help that everywhere we went, they didn't seem to have blackout curtains. So the rooms had these beautiful like gingham curtains and things, and like brilliant sun shining on your face at 3 a.m. So
what did you do to prevent the light?
I slept with socks on my face. It's like, whatever you need to do, like put your pillow on your head, put your socks on your head. But just trying to make darkness for yourself, because you don't realize, I think, how much. I mean, we take for granted that kind of coziness at this time of year. Yeah, we know the dark's coming and it can be heavy and oppressive, and seasonal affective disorder, and like there are a lot of people that really, really suffer. And yet there are those times where you have camaraderie and you have companionship, and
it's almost like the season of hibernation, and
there can be comfort in that as well. Like that dark space turns into a space of light, but it became something kind of mythic, this darkness that we were chasing that we couldn't find. I had colleagues who drank a lot to deal with the 24-hour daylight, and and people coped with it in different ways. And we were on public display all the time, not like all the time showering on public, but we shared.
It was that kind of cruise.
Nudie cruise. we shared cabins. So my bunkmate and I, we were in 8 by 8 foot cabins. You'd have 2 bunks and a little tiny bathroom, and that was all the space you had. You're literally, that was it. And then there was the common room, and then there was the deck. And that was great, except when you're under sail and it's minus 15, it's really cold to be on deck all the time. So we were packed into these spaces, and people are missing home, and people are frightened, and people are angry, or personalities kind of grind against each other, and you get friction. And we're all going through these same routines very publicly with no privacy. So you know how it is when you're in a place where you're worried or you're stressed out or you don't know how you're going to deal with the situation or particular people, and there's nowhere to go to get that privacy. You can't just retire in the evening and just take yourself
to your
off.
room. Because your room isn't your own.
Nope. And also there's no darkness. You can't even go up on deck and not assume you're going to be seen, because it's the Arctic and it's snowy and it's 24-hour daylight, and it's like being under a searchlight all the time. So dark emerged as this character, as something that I longed for, and started thinking about all the ways we go, we try to achieve that darkness in that type of situation.
Light almost seems to become like the panopticon. Like how you're always visible to other people, and then you're always visible outside. And
The polar bears can see you 24 hours a day.
Polar bears.
They can.
I want to know. There's stuff about the polar bears I want to ask after. So how did you come across the writer-in-residence position, and what was the experience of writing the book like for you?
Okay, so first, how did I come across the position? I applied for it like any other residency. And
you just researched and found it? Yeah. Or did someone tell you about it? Or
no, I was going through, I forget now the list that I had gone through. It was just talking about residencies around the world, and I had been on a few, and I saw that one. I thought, I've always wanted to go see the Arctic. And then I thought, Norwegian Arctic, that would be really neat. I'd like to see something very, very different from the Canadian Arctic. Although some similar through lines. And so you have to apply with a project, same as you would to, Banff Center or Sage Hill or anything. Right. And so originally I had applied with a project to write about the male polar explorers in the Arctic by air, talking about the dirigible or the blimp explorations of the Arctic in the 20s. because there was a pretty spectacular blimp crash with an Italian airship captain and general right on Spitsbergen, right where we were traveling. And I thought, what are the chances that I'm actually going to see like the mooring mast of this blimp that crashed there?
Oh, yeah.
And so I thought, well, these are great stories. Arctic by air, a totally different kind of air. And the story of the crash, I mean, the guys were dumped out onto the Arctic ice. The basket separated from the blimp. The blimp took off with half the crew, never seen again. The basket dumped out by Ny Alesund, which is the northernmost settlement on Spitsbergen.
Yeah.
Dumped half the crew onto the ice, including the general, and apparently his dog. I don't know why he had his dog with him.
Well,
Who wants to leave
you know,
their
you
dog
can't
at
leave your
home?
dog.
I don't know how much you believe that, but anyway. It's like, he brought his dog to the Arctic. Why not? What could go wrong? He had a crate of rations, a tent, and a radio fell out on the ice.
Really?
Like, if you're going to get dumped on the Arctic ice, like, what better way? So it was the first polar air rescue mission, international polar air rescue mission, to pull these guys in off the ice. So I was going to write about that, and because there's some great stories. And then I got there and I looked at the landscape, and I started noticing how all the stories were the male narrative, and I wanted to dig more. And I thought, there are women here. Mm-hmm. I mean, I was meeting the polar bear guards. I was meeting women in Longyearbyen settlement, and talking to them and saying, "What's life like here?" And reading little snippets. Every once in a while at the museum, you'd see like a women's exhibit, or you'd have like a woman in a byline. And I started thinking, I want to write about that. So the book became about the women's narrative.
Which we're going to ask you about more, because I'm really drawn to that.
Can we talk a little bit more maybe about them once we get into the deeper dive? But at least the style and form in this collection, because it gets billed through the publisher as a travelogue, you know, with poetic meditations, with poetic meditations.
Mediation?
I know, mediations, like you're mediating yourself in the land. Like, that would have been better. Take that to
revised
Kathy.
catalog copy.
And I know that Ray and I had both talked about this, that we thought of the collection as more of prose poems.
Yeah.
Especially because everything, you know, is a short poetic exploration of all these little details and stuff. So, you know, what sort of inspired the form and how you wrote it?
Yeah, and I'm so glad you call them prose poems, because to me they're prose poems. And when I was working with my editor, he was saying, they're kind of like little essays. And so there are places where he told me to extend. And I was happy with how they turned out. But to me, they're prose poems.
They're prose poems.
Thank you for saying that.
We're here to acknowledge that.
Yeah.
This is a safe
They're
space
now
for poetry.
officially prose poems.
Yeah.
Not mini essays. Really, really mini essays. But yeah, I was... The first couple of pieces in the book, when I started crafting them, I was messing around with free verse poems. And when I write free verse, I tend to have quite clipped lines. And I tend to play with space on the page a lot, because I'm trying to play with breath. One of the things I'm usually really interested in is how disconnected the body gets from page poetry. And I think when I'm talking with my students, they say that's one of the things that when they're reading a poem, they tend to engage with the head instead of the body. Except for, you know, if the poem has kind of like a heart line that just skewers you. But they forget that the body's involved. So I tend to mess with spacing quite a bit on the page, because I'm trying to make the reader breathe a certain way by having to read across the gaps.
Right.
And by doing so, you feel something in your body. Like, I can make you feel quite terrified by the way I use the spacing in a page, because by the time you read to the end of the page, you're suddenly out of breath because you've had to make all these jumps and gaps on the page. And I thought the Arctic landscape, though, has so many gaps. It's a space of these huge vastnesses, and I didn't want to have that type of writing. So the prose poetry worked really well, I think, for me, for what I was trying to represent with the landscape, because it allowed me to pack in all of the detail. It allowed me to do this 24-hour daylight, kind of like gather all this stuff up that I'm seeing and push it out to the reader, all this description, but not have to represent in the gaps the vastnesses of that space. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it's so interesting. I'm really, really intrigued by that description and how you pulled away from the vastness of it to put it on the page in a much more condensed and almost cyclical kind of description.
Yeah, I think it's just because I couldn't have conceived of that space before I went there.
Yeah.
And I had a kind of a mental picture of it and what I had looked at online, but when you get there, it just blows you wide open because it's just, you're so far away from people, and even in the middle of summer, everything is so snow-covered, and you can very easily do yourself to death by, jumping out of the boat into the ocean. You'd think it would be innocuous, but you can freeze yourself to death doing that.
Did you jump out of the boat into the ocean?
I did not jump out of the boat. I did go swimming, but you have to wade in from the beach, and it is really cold. But so, I was trying to capture so much of that space and render it in a way that was easily accessible. So I didn't want people have to fight over the gaps already in the poem.
Yeah.
I figured that would be too much, having to deal with all of the detailed descriptions plus the space of the words on the page. So
Well, and the language that you use is so rich and fills so much, I think, inside a person when they're reading it, that you didn't need those gaps.
I'm really glad you say that, because I was trying not to have the form kind of work against the content, I guess.
Right, right.
Yeah.
Can we talk about the length of some of the sections?
Yeah.
And how, like there's shorter ones that are only, 3 parts. And like I think of, I guess, like the larger poetic essay as a section. And then, there's each separate image within. Yeah. So, what decided those lengths, or how many numbered parts of each section there would be? I strove for consistency, and then I thought, nah, because within I like the numbered sections because then I can have 3 or 4 different parts in a section. I could take one particular thing that I'm looking at and look at it from 3 or 4 different angles, or tell interconnected pieces of a story. But I found it really hard. It's still poetry, and it's really hard to say to the poem, you're done now, when it doesn't feel done. Yeah.
So some sections are 7 or 8, 6 or 7 parts, and some sections are 3 parts. And there were places where I tried to kind of shoehorn in more stuff to make the sections balance out. And you know how it is with a poem. You get that kind of after effect where there's a few lines just kind of dragging their tails at the end of the poem, and you have to cut them off. So, some of the sections got reduced. So, still prose poetry.
It's poetry.
Still fighting for it to be what it is.
It is what it is.
Yep.
Yeah.
Travelogue is capacious, though, right? You can fit a lot of things in that sack, whatever the travelogue is.
The sack of
Travelogue.
So patriarchal.
Sounds kind of
Yeah, like I only think of like I took an 18th century literature course, and I feel like that's the only time I've ever used the word travelogue. And so like when it ever comes up since then, I'm just always like,
I just had a vision of like traveling on WestJet airline, and because you're going to write a travelogue.
Don't forget your sack. They're charging extra for sacks now. Yeah, you can bring, If you have a really heavy sack, you can't bring that on the plane. You have to
Matthew.
keep that tucked away.
Matthew. Let's jump and maybe ask Jenna to read another poem before we move into kind of the next larger context of our discussion today.
And the rosé.
And we will open up the bottle of rosé. So we're gonna have Jenna read from Ornithomancy to lead us into the next section of our discussion today. Do you want to take that and
Sure, absolutely.
go with that, Jenna?
And so ornithomancy, of course, is that type of divination done through the flights of birds. And that was one of the things in the Arctic that totally struck me, was the amazing bird life. And because it was over the summer solstice, all the seabirds were coming in to land, and the breeding was just crazy. There were eggs everywhere you looked, and the terns nest right on the road. And they will attack you when you get close. So half of you were navigating on land, you were ducking and covering to stay away from the terns, because they land on your head and grab your hair. So it was just trying to navigate that landscape. You couldn't walk in a straight line. You'd have to go around the turn. So part of it was navigating all these birds. It was kind of Hitchcockian at times. Wow. And also, there's a section in this prose poem where there's an underlying narrative I mentioned of this women's narrative that comes through.
Yes.
And being in the Arctic as a woman who had been told not too long before that you can no longer have a shot at having live children. So I had just learned that. So there was that sense of everywhere you look, there was like life, 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 life. And I was sitting there going, I still haven't sort of processed my own news. So ornithomancy starts off, all of them start with an epigraph. This one's by Kathleen Jamie, amazing writer. In September, countless sand and house martins jazz above the river, taking insects from the surface, from the air, thousands of birds kissing the river farewell. They creak, a sound like the air rutting against itself. Summer is everything they know. They're preparing themselves, sensing in the shortening days a door they must dash through before it shuts. Pleated bone flutes open against rock. Arctic tern caught, sunning, breast jimmied open by the rummagings of the fox. Little left but the half-moon curve of her beak, a startlement of pinions. The sun is directly overhead 24 hours a day. Death leaps at me with the intensity of searchlights. Bones bleach and fissure over a matter of weeks, the only shade directly beneath where the blood slips, pools, sprouts a small tuft of grass almost overnight. Death is immediate, and life in this pressure chamber of northern summer is nearly as quick. The terns nest with a sort of desperation, clenched in their thousands among the stones, splayed and vulnerable. My walk a drunken weave, skirting that nest and this, the airborne ire of mothers. Live wire buzzing, the young that do hatch are raised in a ratcheting of fear, 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 haptic filaments needling through the spaces in their bones. Off Spitsbergen, Fanshawe lifts its dolerite skirts ribbed with whalebone and eggshells. Guillemots rasp into the air in their thousands, adamantine hammer of sound that drills in somewhere behind the eyes. I feel the birds as much as see them. In my blood is a new element, a battering of wings, mad clangor. The land is contoured in a way that breeds sound. It sloughs from the bird cliffs, heaves over the water in a rich, acrid roll. Along the shoreline, sound clatters between the growlers, barks chips off the larger bergs. All through the afternoon, champagne tinkle of ice chips as the slabs greet each other across narrow channels in the green. Wind-burned, eyes closed, this. Beneath the keening of bergs, a deeper thresh of glaciers calving, creaking with sun. Sound of earth, her bones, wide russet bowl of hips splaying open. From these sear flanks, her desiccating body, what a sea change is born. Magdalena Fjorden at the solstice, the scree slopes greening overnight as the little ox come in from the sea, fast and fetid life clamping itself to the stones. Blue eggs erupt from the cliffside like a party trick, their shadows sewn beneath them. Imagine what it is to be called through the bones, daylight playing itself out in your marrow. This knowing that draws you in from hundreds of miles out to sea, slices you cleanly through the spindrift to shore. What it must be to understand the pull in your blood this way, an old, old calling. What it must be like to know your direction without fear. Eggs that mysteriously appeared and vanished again, palmed, fainted, perfect diversion, child's birthday trick. When your nieces hunted up your sleeve, small hands darting like voles, how the laughter would roll out of you while the secret stayed put. Somewhere was a prize and you weren't telling. Better than a chocolate shell, something real. You imagined it held delicately against your teeth, your tongue, certain that when they pried your lips apart, the secret would scattershot into the world like a small bird. You held my hips that way, as though you were framing sky, permitting egress, flight. As though my body too could be palmed, appeared and disappeared like a vaudeville trick. Somewhere a small skittering of claws, tattoo of wings. What we didn't know then, how winter breaks down a nest from the outside in, weathering its bindings to silver. The way the cage of the body can break open at a touch and nothing flies forth. No sound, no tumult of rattled feathers, just empty air and light.
Thank you so much for that, Jenna. That was really beautiful.
Thank you.
Okay.
It was, and I'm going to introduce a short wine break.
Oh, wine break!
Yeah, we opened up the rosé now.
Oh,
And
I'm
so-
excited to give a taste, or have a taste of this one. Yes.
That's the good part. And
good part.
Jenna, you watch and you say
All
when.
the good parts.
That's good. Okay, you're welcome. I don't say when for my wine. It just keeps going. It's more like
say brim.
it's like why, but then why not? You know.
Wine, why not?
Why not?
Oh.
Oh my.
That's how I feel about things.
Okay. So, Jenna, with the last reading, I mean, it was so powerful and evocative, and the book really focuses a lot on the female narrative you talked about earlier, how you had originally thought that you were going to be writing about the male story, and instead you discovered that the female narrative was more urgent and more imperative.
Yeah.
So can you talk to us a little bit about that and how you came to that realization? And
It seemed like the male narrative was too easy, and not in the sense of downplaying what the polar explorers went through, because I can only imagine, having been on that boat for 2 weeks during the summer, what it would have been like for a season in one of those boats, or being bound in the ice for a winter. But easy in the sense that all the narratives that I found were male, and so the information was readily available. And even though it felt like there were some really good stories there, and some of that narrative made its way into the collection, but the focus totally shifted because the women that I was running into on Spitsbergen, and these little narratives that would pop up here and there in displays, and the people that I would talk to in town, these women were amazing. It's a hard life. The men predominantly have a script. They are the miners. They are involved in tourism, or they run a company or whatever, and the women don't. A lot of times they come along as family. They're occasionally raising children, miners' wives. They're in sometimes really isolated settlements, and they have no script. They have no way of kind of coordinating their days. So the men have these particular expectations, and the women just have this vastness to deal with. It's not just the landscape, it's in the roles have changed, and the community has changed, and some of those settlements are really tight-knit communities, and yet they're I think they're that way out of necessity. Like, I think for a lot of the women, that's a survival tactic. So they were strong. They were really amazing people, and I respected them a lot. I got to talk to and got to know the 3 polar bear guards that were on our boat.
yeah, I want to know more.
The polar bear guards. And we kind of called them the Vikings with high-powered rifles. They seriously were. Like, one had amazing dreadlocks and everything. It was like that TV show, Vikings. Some of the women off of that. I just thought, you put them in the 21st century and give them a
I've actually not watched that show, but I need to, because
now you just
I'm so drawn to it.
Yeah, my family's obsessed with it, and that usually is enough of a sign that I probably wouldn't like it that
Oh,
Okay.
I haven't seen it. Okay.
Yeah.
But they were just really strong women. They were very grounded in the land. They were. They weren't from that landscape. A lot of people who are on Spitsbergen, they come from away and they're drawn to that landscape. And so it's very, very multicultural. And so you've got these women from around the world who call themselves they're partly from the Arctic, but they're partly from somewhere else. They're partly from Spain, or they're partly from mainland Norway, they're partly from wherever it is, New Zealand. And they split their time. A lot of them split the dark season, they go back home. And then during the tourist season, they're back on Spitsbergen.
Is it a big tourist culture?
Not like a huge tourist culture, just because the town itself is so small.
Right.
But they do get a lot of the cruise ships now starting to come through, so that's an element of the Arctic that wasn't there as much 10 years ago. And so there too, I mean, the environment is starting to shift, because you've got these huge cruise liners pulling through. You've got more of the National Geographic expeditions coming in. But yeah, the women's stories were something I didn't expect. It's such an odd place, not just the landscape, but also the way the human lifespan is curtailed. So they don't have a ton of medical facilities there. So if you're a woman who's about to give birth and it's not an emergency, you're often sent off the island to somewhere where there's better health care. So maybe mainland Norway. And there's no way of burying you after you die there, because permafrost. Although that might shift because the Arctic's warming. So you've got this kind of curtailed life. Birth, death, both are kind of shunted out. If you're unemployed, you can't stay there because there's not a huge social net. So it's this community that really, it's tight-knit, and it functions together, but also it's got these kind of limbs that are lopped off. And so I think particularly that impacts women's narratives, you know, thinking about the whole birth cycle and, you know, and raising a family in those areas. So the whole book shifted rapidly, and I was much happier with where it ended up because it felt more true. That was something that was pulling me. And I was very glad that I mean, the men appear in the book in counterpoint to the women, but they become the footnote. And that was something that I wanted to do. Like, yes, this is the acknowledged history. Shunt, you know, off to the side.
Although there is one male, Sasha, who's Pyramidon.
Yeah, the tourist guide at Pyramidon.
Yeah.
Yeah,
he was a real character that drew me in for sure.
Yeah, he sort of embodied Russia, you know, Russia almost a century ago, with the great coat and the hat and everything, the fur hat, and just an amazing character. And I think he would have to be because Pyramidon is technically a ghost town. Now, there's two major Russian mining colonies on Svalbard. One is Pyramidon, one is Barentsburg. Barentsburg has been, I don't think it was ever really shut down. It might have been around the Second World War, but it's been repopulated. Pyramidon was definitely closed down around the Second World War. There are fewer than 20 men, no women, who live there year-round. Russian expats. And predominantly they pick metal and they pack it onto the resupply ships to Murmansk and send it back over the ocean. And that is what they do. And they are there for various reasons. Personal reasons. Why would you want to exile yourself to a former Russian mining colony? Yeah, they've got some stories. But language barrier, so I didn't really get to learn a lot of them.
Do you have a favorite moment from the time that with the women that you met?
Yes, I do.
That you feel comfortable sharing?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Do they feel comfortable? No. No, I think they would probably just laugh. So, like I said, they were Vikings with high-powered rifles. They're just phenomenal women. A couple of them had flaming red hair. They were,
and these are the polar bear guards.
Polar bear guards.
Yeah, I'm just so intrigued by this.
They were just incredible. Every time we went we made landfall. We went to the mainland. The polar bear guards would have to go out and triangulate, and so the artists and scientists had to stay within the triangle. They were on guard at all times because a polar bear can scent you from over 10 kilometers away.
Wow.
And if they're hungry, they'll find you. If they're bored, they'll find you. They'll find you because they can. Yeah, we had a couple of experiences where there were polar bears, you know, swimming on some of the drift ice and one on the shore. And they were very aware that we were there. So the polar bear guards were constantly out there, and they were constantly kind of testing themselves and keeping active. They would do this kind of parkour almost around the ship's deck every morning. Just like not touching the deck. They would climb on the rigging. They would climb around the edge of the deck just to keep in shape. And so
makes me want to go on my 5-mile run a little more.
So one day, this memory, oh my goodness. So one day we just come in off the beachhead, and the Zodiac was taking us out to the ship. Zodiac went in, got the last group of artists, and we suddenly realized, polar bear guards, where are they? And we could hear them back on the beach. We got out to the boat, and there were these little specks in the distance. And then we're just like, are they not wearing anything? We could just see like little flesh-colored specks. And they were going Arctic swimming. We were off on the boat, and they just struck down, and they were swimming out in the Arctic Ocean. Apparently one of them is like an Arctic swimmer. That's what she does. She competes.
In the Arctic Ocean that you will freeze to death in.
If you jump
in.
Yeah. And so that's like an endurance swim there. And they were just having a great time, and apparently that's just something they do.
So who was watching for the polar bears?
Good question.
I am sure that they had a couple of them back, like, watching the polar bears.
Knowing them, they could probably just, like, you know, rush to shore, whip out the rifle, and take out the polar bear all in one fell swoop. Who knows?
I just always wonder, like, who watches the Watchmen?
Watchers.
You know?
Yeah, right? But that kind of spoke to me about them. They were hardcore. I valued them a lot.
I love that. I love that story, and I love that there are women like that offering stories to us. Yeah.
Another theme that I wanted to draw us toward at this moment is kind of another human element of the narrative that kind of continues throughout the travelogue that you touched on a little bit earlier about, you know, the human effect on the landscape in terms of the garbage and other things that you see, and watching the glaciers recede and how that marks time, and other things that are sort of going on at the same time, and even talking about, like, you know, the seed vault, and I think of the recent news of, you know, like how that's a human attempt to hold on to things, but it's not perfect because, you know, it's flooding, and so...
And it's in Svalbard.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. And so I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about your exploration in that, and, you know, the human effects on things.
Yeah, the human effects on things were everywhere, considering it was so sparsely populated. The history of the mining settlements is right there. And because those mining settlements, like I said, some of them have been abandoned and then reclaimed, it's like decades of this history is leaking everywhere. There's mine tailings and mine ruins and everything. And the whaling history is all over. A couple of the photos I have in the book, that was one thing I really appreciated about the book. I was allowed to put black and white photos from the trip throughout it.
Yeah, they're gorgeous. I love them. And you took those all.
I took the photos. Yeah. So that was a really a gift to be able to do that. And some of the photos in the book are the bone beds from the whaling stations. So there's the other element of human history, and the bone beds are so big you can see them when you're out at sea. You can see these kind of white, like bleached white bone beds just firing under the sun because it's so bright during the summer. And then the tourist history, and like I said, the garbage and the remnants. You have to be so careful what you leave behind. You can't really drop anything. Everything has to come with you. So it was this peculiar sense that you are kind of celebrating that landscape and how utterly different it is from anything else you've seen, and also mourning at the same time that there's nowhere that human settlement doesn't touch. You know, seeing this stuff washed up from who knows where around the world. And then thinking also about the connection back home, and thinking about the boreal forest. I mean, our farm is up at the very southern edge of the boreal, and already there's, you know, gravel pit, there's oil and gas, there's all sorts of industrial development and stuff creeping up that way. And so thinking about what's happening to the environment where we are, and seeing some through lines with human impact from the Arctic back home.
Yeah, I thought that was a really intelligent tie-in that with any journey there's the return home, and so like, you know, you have the songs to the boreal section of the book, you know, just to talk about the forest fires and that feeling, and like especially with the recent summer, and how even that effect came to Edmonton and a lot of Western Canada. And I was hoping maybe that you could touch on what you hope people will take away from the poems that you're sharing, and like these connections that you're making between climate change. You know, what is the reaction that you want people to have? Or
I think probably twofold. I mean, one, that it is happening. I saw it firsthand up in the Arctic, and it was you're prepared intellectually, but you are not prepared how much it blows your heart out when you see it, when you see the glaciers push back like that, when you see that garbage everywhere. And so that it is very real. And then I come home and I see the impacts of it as a farmer out on the land, with, you know, the increasingly unpredictable weather cycles and systems and flooding. And so when people say climate change isn't happening, I'm like, well, hang on a second. You're telling me from two sides of the world.
Hold up.
This angry farmer would disagree with you.
Yeah.
And also to not take it for granted, just because these landscapes are out of regular reach. Don't take them for granted. I mean, we often just see them on the internet. That was my only experience of the Norwegian Arctic before I left, right? I might never get the chance to go back. That whether they're in your sort of regular routine or not, whether you move through those spaces or not, that to be respectful of them and to know how interconnected they are. You know, whatever you're over on the ocean and Halifax or something, you chuck that cup into the water, who knows where it's going to end up?
Right.
Yeah.
It was just phenomenal seeing how far some of the trash had traveled.
Well, I mean, you found out where it ends up.
Yeah.
Spitsbergen, who knew?
Yeah.
Svalbard.
In Svalbard.
Yeah. So just to think really carefully about the spaces that we inhabit, and that just because somewhere is halfway across the world and seems like a moonscape, it is very, very similar in so many ways to this place, to this home. Yeah.
It's a good thought that I hope people take away from when they read the collection as well.
Yeah. So I feel like this is the opportune time to maybe talk a little bit about your off-grid farm and all of the work that you've been doing to manage and build it, and how that feeds back into the concept or the idea of having a writer's retreat. And so there's all these different parts of your life that are really connecting. So can you talk to us a little bit about the tie-ins that you see between the Arctic, the North, and the off-grid farm?
Yeah, definitely. The farm has been something that has grown by leaps and bounds on us. We just started off back in 2006 wanting to live a simpler kind of life. We were sick and tired of the city, and we wanted to build towards a point where we can be out there full time, and also just wanted to be more responsible for our food and for our impact on the planet. So over the years, we've been putting in solar. We've been working with a good friend of ours who is an amazing carpenter. We designed the plans for our farmhouse and hopefully what will be our little writer's retreat cabin. And he built them from local materials. So we've been trying to kind of support the local economy, build local food systems, just get to know a place as well. My husband and I both come from away. I come from England. He's from Holland. So getting to know a space, and it felt really important to build that space with our own hands if we were going to earn a spot in the community that's already there. So we've got so many layers of neighbors and narratives, indigenous, settler history of various, generations of various decades. We felt like we needed to do that by, with our own two hands, so that we kind of carved out our own spot. And so it's been a growth experience. It started off very small, but then as we started building the farm, we learned how many people were interested in that.
Right.
And so the community built as the farm built. And thinking back to what I was saying about global warming and climate change, just this past summer, we had to move our entire farm from one end of our property up to the hayfield at the other end of the property. I hate that term, property. Anyway, the land. I don't like that term at all. I think of us as caretakers rather than owners.
Yeah.
But because we were flooding, our county has been flooding and flooding and flooding, and we thought you can only rebuild a space so many times before the heart is gone out of you. So we moved the whole farm, and there's this amazing sense of hope that's just come back to us in that space, which has been absent for a couple of years now, and we didn't realize how much it was seeping away until we rebuilt and moved into this incredible new space, a little bit higher ground, and suddenly the desire to be out there again in all the seasons is there, and also we're way more aware of how much that ecosystem is changing. The boreal forest is changing. We saw that this summer with the wildfires. We saw that a few summers ago with Fort Mac burning down. The fact that we don't allow the forest to go through their natural cycle of burn and regrowth, and then we have these catastrophic fires.
Yeah.
And we're living at the very verge of that. So we see that all the time. There are summers where we're surrounded by wildfires.
Wow.
So you're really thinking about, what is the future on this space going to look like? How are we going to interact with the land when we control it in such a way that we don't let it go through these cycles, and then we blame it for when these huge fires erupt or these floods erupt? It's not happening by some other means, it's us. So it really drives that home. And so the Writers' Retreat, I think, is something we've longed to do for quite some time, but also coming back from that experience in the Arctic and just thinking how amazing it was to be in that incredible landscape, and thinking about, wow, the boreal forest too is a pretty incredible place.
Yeah.
It's got its own cycles, it's got its own patterns. It's a landscape that needs to really be deeply watched and learned. And I feel like I could have 10 lifetimes and not have enough time to scratch the surface. But just being able to give people the chance to come out to that place and just experience it. We've got some old growth boreal forest there that's never been touched, it's never been turned. And we want to make that space available for artists. Because it was something that was so generative for me overseas. And I thought, if we can do that here, that would be, it feels like paying it forward.
Yeah.
For opportunities like Svalbard.
It seems very poetic.
Yeah. Well, like the the connection between, the giving back
Yeah.
towards the opportunities that you've received and
Mm-hmm.
everything, and how that's sort of cyclical.
Yeah, and time is marked so much by the ice. And that was one thing I learned about the glaciers. And the old ice is the gray ice. And so when you see a glacier and you see those kind of ragged gray edges, those are the pieces of ice that hold the history. Some of them have been around for hundreds of years. And when a glacier calves, suddenly you have this incredible blue new ice. And it looks like it's been dyed. It's so vivid. And that's the ice that's just been untouched. And I kind of took it a step farther. Like, I'm pretty sure you can't look at the old ice and go, well, that was the fire of whatever year, But it's just that idea that the land, the earth recalls everything we do to it.
Mm-hmm.
Everything. We think that it's just inanimate, that whatever we do just kind of rolls off somehow, But there's a record of everything that we do, and sometimes it's good to be able to see that right in front of your face.
Mm-hmm.
So At the Face starts off with the epigraph from John Muir. Thousands of tired, nerve-shaken, over-civilized people are beginning to find out that going to the mountains is going home, that wilderness is a necessity. To watch a glacier calve is to watch time run in both directions at once. The grey face is the old ice, pitted with history. The blue face is the fresh ice, brilliant and unscarred, razor-edged and untouched. On deck, I watch the berg slough, wind-struck, swing its keen blue face away from land. Calving is a funny thing, birth and death gnarled inseparably. The new berg is a small knell for the glacier cracking its spine along the strait. Each summer a little thinner, ice bruised by a malignant swell of mountain coming clear beneath. In a scant decade there will be only rock. The sway-backed ridge of the glacier will be as much a memory as the whale pods darkening the inlets along Svalbard's flank. Birth and death, companion sides of the card. Up from Port Longyear, the Svalbard seed vault blunts its snout from the permafrost, stuffed with India, the ripe heart of the tropics. Mango and quince, rattlesnake bean, fennel. In this doomsday refrigerator, we trust our luck and double down. Millions of seeds packed into the frigid heart of the hill, waiting for that indistinct time after the glaciers have gone, shed their pockmarked faces into the fjord. Whatever that world resembles, we imagine rosemary and persimmon, white pine weeping with gum. Our vault a hedged bet, a long con. We are in this for the win. Past Antigua's hull, calved bergs float janist-faced, wind bellying them out into the bay, crooked grey shadows back-cast. The blue crags of their birthplace already sun-slagging, gleam weathering to runoff sheen as we watch. The old ice on these mountains carries centuries, the guides tell us. When the others tire and go below deck, I linger at the railing, imagining Mount St. Helens, Bikini Atoll, and Nagasaki, the gunmetal glide of uranium from Canada's north. What we are capable of when we hollow the earth, small gods with hammer and tongs, refineries and their atmospheric smear. In our hands, Vulcan's desire to fashion in his own image, a cacophony of voices forming under his fingers. A face pinched from the clay, distant muttering from a tight-jointed box. Bright-eyed Pandora and her cargo of assassins. Somewhere in this ice, Dachau plumes dark against the blue. London burns from a shop on Pudding Lane. I picture the ice sharding and Vesuvius issuing forth in a charred waft, the withering harmattan over the water from Marrakesh, a caftan of brittle wings. New ice glares blue through the Svalbard dusk, the never-setting sun. What will our record be? This clean face splitting, shape-shifting in looking-glass slides. Ragged Syrian fields driving the farmers to Damascus, Cascadia popping her knuckles along Quequisot and clam gardens. Soot plumes from the Paragominas as the Amazon burns, arsenic flares outside Accra where the Western computers burn. What will this face remember? A Bastille Day truck attack in France, the Pulse nightclub in Orlando, dust and drought in the camps at Kigeme. Perhaps it will see the future rattling by like a deck of cards, sharp shuffle, dab hand, ice thinning over a rictus of rock.
Wow.
Thank you, Jenna.
Thanks.
Yeah. And
Thank you.
yeah, and just thank you for talking with us today about your poetry, your experience in a strange place,
Yes.
and just sharing your worldly wisdom. Who will listen?
Thanks so much for the conversation. It's been really wonderful.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think we want to again thank Gurvinder Bhatia and the Writers Guild of Alberta for being amazing partners and supporting the podcast. And to keep up to date on the podcast, you can follow us on Twitter at lets_lit. And you can subscribe and listen to the podcast on audioboom.com and more places where you listen to your favorite podcasts. But aside from all of that, I feel deeply honored to have had this conversation with you today. And I think Matthew agrees.
I do.
Yes.
I do. And
Yes. All right.
yeah. We'll just
So why don't we have a cheers to end the evening?
sounds good.